Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Welcome to our Introduction to Municipal Readiness webinar series, and featuring guest speaker Greg Rodriguez from Stantec today, talking about mobility, innovation, and next generation infrastructure considerations. My name is Lee St. James, and I am the Managing Director of the Urban Robotics Foundation. I'm your MC and host for today. Unfortunately, Bern Grush wasn't able to join us today. He's our Executive Director, an author, speaker, and thought leader, and with over 20 years of experience in standards writing, and the global lead for the ISO 4448, which is sort of how the Urban Robotics Foundation was founded. I joined the group in February of this year with a focus more on building the community of stakeholders and really getting into more strategic marketing communications related to municipal readiness. And so that's really where this series came from. Today, we're going to talk about what are public area mobile robots, what are some of the challenges. We're going to do a short introduction to the URF, excuse me for that mistake there. Our guest speaker is Greg Rodriguez, and then a Q&A, and then if time permits afterwards, we'll talk about the ISO 4448. So in terms of public area mobile robots, what we're focused on at the Urban Robotics Foundation is a subsegment of the mobility innovations that Greg will be talking about today. And so what we're really focused on are ground-based devices with wheels or legs or tracks. They're unmanned, sometimes and most often teleoperated, at least to a certain percent or in emergency situations. And the key distinguishing feature about these devices is that they operate in public pedestrian spaces. So walkways, sidewalks, pathways, malls that could be indoor or outdoor, hospitals, zoos, and things like that. And they perform a range of tasks, and more tasks are coming online all the time. And so the one that's probably getting most attention in the media is around food delivery, but there are certainly lots of other applications and potential benefits to improve livability in our urban centers. So out of scope for the work that we do are industrial and manufacturing robots, so anything that operates only around trained personnel. Farming, agricultural robots, drones are not within scope for the work that we do, but you'll hear a little bit about that from Greg. And then also e-scooters and e-bikes are out of scope for our work, but obviously are impacting our mobility, innovation, and urban spaces as well. And some of the lessons that we are developing and trying to share are certainly applicable in a number of these other technologies as well. What we want to talk about in terms of the challenges that we face are the differences between operating in a very structured environment where people know what's happening, and there's training provided for everybody who's around that robot, whereas in unstructured environments that are changing all the time. This is a dramatic example from a report that was done by the Knight Foundation on a sidewalk in Pittsburgh. So you'll see that is obviously a huge challenge for the devices that we're talking about today. Other challenges really are related to failures of the technology, where safety and accessibility are impacted. So this is an example from a video that we took where a robot failed after it started into an intersection. Another robot came along to help it, and it got stuck as well. So then a bystander, a pedestrian, started to try to help. And then a couple of people came in to try to help. And so again, public acceptance was there. The people in this, I believe this is all in Santa Monica, they are aware of these robots around and trying to help them. But what they ended up doing was leaving them in, blocking the accessibility pathway for anybody who might be in a wheelchair or have challenges stepping up onto the curb. So at the end of the program, at the end of this video segment, the staff person from the robot company actually came to take the disabled robot away. The robot that was still working went across the intersection, and you'll see this is a driver error where a driver comes and blocks the pathway. It's a green light for the cars going straight ahead, and you can see that there's a car actually now blocking the robot from going backwards because it's also turning the corner. So the safety issues then come out. It's like, what happens with the robot? The robot goes out into the laneway and could, hopefully this driver actually sees the robot with the little flag on top, but there are all kinds of behavioral issues that come up that we're addressing in our work. Another area is around supporting people with accessibility issues. So this person has a condition called kyphosis, where they can't see, they can only see straight down in front of them. So the questions that come up are, will the public area mobile robots alarm her, potentially block her path? So there are some challenges, but then also there are some positives. So could they deliver groceries to her? Could they follow her and carry her bags for her, or even protect her in some ways? So there are pros and cons, and we're really looking to explore those as part of our work with the Urban Robotics Foundation. So just to wrap up this section on the URF, we were founded in October 21, and we operate at the intersection of urban space, accessibility, and mobile robots. The draft ISO 4448 will be published by the ISO actually starting in 2024, so we're a little bit ahead of schedule. We're also writing and publishing a series of municipal readiness guidebooks that you'll hear more about in the coming weeks and months. And we also deliver workshops and provide advisory services. In terms of our goals, we are looking to strengthen stakeholder readiness and prepare urban ecosystems for robots in public pedestrian spaces. I'm going to wrap up now and just hand it straight over to Greg. I think that he has a fascinating presentation that I'm sure you will enjoy. And I'll be monitoring the chat. Please enter your questions as you go in, as they occur. And if there's something urgent as I see it, I'll interrupt Greg and ask him to answer the question, but hopefully we'll wait until the end of the chat. And thank you for those people who joined after I started. Hopefully there are no challenges getting into, I was able to just disable the waiting room. So I'm thankful that I can see some more people there now. So Greg, I stop sharing my screen and then hand it over to you.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thank you, Lee. Let me see if I can get the technology to work.
Perfect.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Just a quick disclaimer. I'm navigating my first bout of COVID, so I think I have enough tea with me and I have enough liquid, so hopefully I don't start coughing, but thanks for your patience as I work through that. Lee, thanks for that intro. I think that was really helpful as you set the stage when we're talking about all the opportunities around automation. I particularly liked your slide around structured versus unstructured. I think that's an important part of the conversation. And also you pointing out some of the failures. I think that's something we'll talk about hopefully a little bit today, but it's okay to fail. I think that's a part of the testing process that we're in. And hopefully we can learn from those failures and continue to move the technology forward, aligning it with the right use cases, and also having that conversation around infrastructure. You provided that really great picture from Pittsburgh, focused on some of the existing conditions with the sidewalk, growth of trees or brush. And that's something we shouldn't just be considering for robots or automation, but also just for increased pedestrian access. And particularly myself, who now has a 3.5-year-old, living in DC, Mayor Bowser, who I commend, when she also had a child, really realized what poor condition our infrastructure was in, just for being able to safely walk and move. And so hopefully as we continue to advance the automation conversation around infrastructure, we can also advance infrastructure improvements for people as well. So with all that, quick introduction to myself. My name is Greg Rodriguez. I'm based out of Washington, DC. I'm part of Stantec's Smarter Mobility Group. The Smarter, as you see on the screen, stands for navigating smarter cities, smart city solutions, smart mobility innovations, but also making sure that we're focused on equity and resilience as well. And our definition of resilience, while Stantec as a whole is doing a lot of work around climate change, our focus is on operational resilience. And I think that's where this conversation comes into play, of really thinking about how do we continue to increase mobility options, increase services through mobility, and kind of, to be candid, if we do face the next COVID shutdown, how do we make sure that people aren't left behind? Our most vulnerable users of the transportation system, when public transportation was the first thing taken out, how do we make sure that doesn't happen again and that we provide services to those people most in need? I always like to set the stage to say that the conversation today should and needs to be more than just autonomous vehicles or automation. And again, that's where we get into the conversation around infrastructure, which I'm excited about. I'm a big fan of the movie A Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. I know when we're talking about automation, we like to kind of separate the infrastructure conversation from the technology, but this is my own personal opinion and what, I'm seeing in some of the projects we're working on. If we don't talk about the two hand in hand, then I struggle to see how we really scale this and commercialize it from a long-term perspective. And some of the things that we're working on that merge the conversation around innovation and infrastructure are things like mobility hubs. How do we really leverage these hubs to support both the movement of people from a public transportation perspective, but also, thinking about things like lockers or things that we can put in the public right of way that can support automation and also people having more access to services they might need and being able to do everything with one stop. The conversation around parking and corridors, how do we leverage space, all that you see on here. And I, again, just want to set the stage that we need to be thinking about both the technology, but also future infrastructure needs. And we also need to be thinking about the partnerships and funding that's going to be needed to pay for the infrastructure. So, obviously we're seeing here in the United States a lot of momentum around electric vehicles, which is great to see. But with that, we're seeing declining revenue from the gas tax. And so we really need to start confronting the fiscal cliff we're facing to think about what are these new funding mechanisms we're going to need to be able to support future infrastructure needs and build that future infrastructure. So I think, most people on this call are likely very engaged in the autonomous space, are excited about the autonomous space, may also be skeptics. But, I think it's important to be thinking about why are we talking about autonomous vehicles? I think the number one thing out there that I completely agree with is a safety opportunity. There are far too many car crashes, far too many car deaths that occur from human error. So I'm a strong proponent that autonomy can reduce those number of errors. But there is the challenge around how to navigate a mixed use environment. Lee showed those great photos of the interaction of the testing of autonomous vehicles with, people driving cars, people walking. There's important outreach and education that's needed. And I think the challenging conversation around whether or not we can indeed have a mixed use environment, or from an infrastructure perspective, whether or not we should have a dedicated lane for autonomous vehicles. And I know that brings up complicated conversations around traffic, brings up complicated conversations around equity, but I think it's an important conversation that we need to have. From an economic development perspective, there's a reason a number of cities and states are embracing innovation. There is the economic development opportunity, whether it be bringing new companies from a manufacturing perspective. We're definitely seeing that, again, from electric vehicles and battery manufacturing. We're working with a couple of different clients in the advanced air mobility space that are building warehouses in different states that we're working in, and manufacturing facilities. So innovation does have an important economic development opportunity. And then, of course, the equity and accessibility. I think, again, Lee had that great slide of the woman walking. How could we help people like that get food or medical supplies delivered to them in a safe way? How to enhance our services for our most vulnerable populations. And then, of course, sustainability and resilience. If we can achieve that mecca of level 5 automation and that heaven scenario that a lot of us talk about, then it should decrease the amount of traffic on our roads, hopefully lead to more efficient movement of vehicles and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But that takes a holistic approach to transportation, and not forgetting the challenge around making sure that we're leveraging public transportation and shared mobility as well. So I think we've been here before. Many of us grew up watching the Jetsons. The picture on the right is in many a literature talking about the future of transportation that's been around for a number of years. And I think, an interesting question that I asked myself while getting ready for this presentation is, why has it been so hard to move some of these innovative solutions forward? I've had the pleasure of diving into the governance and regulatory issues around the integration of autonomous vehicles. And I think one observation I have is, we keep trying to fit technologies into laws and regulations created for human-driven vehicles. And I think, again, we similar to how I'm challenging us to think about how we confront the infrastructure conversation, I think we need to start to really confront the governance and regulatory conversation in a way that allows us to move beyond the status quo, if you will. And before coming to Stantec, I was a practicing attorney, so I'm very much immersed in the legal world and really thinking about, what is the right approach to advancing new laws and regulations to help us navigate all these opportunities we have around mobility. And I think that's what this slide is really trying to help us think about a little bit. So I think there's lots of demands on our public right-of-way right now that we're seeing come forward in a good way. As I mentioned, we're doing a lot of work around mobility hubs here at Stantec, and it's great to see people are walking, people are biking. Here in Washington, D.C., we're seeing a rise in e-bikes and cargo bikes. People are using scooters, and I'm seeing more people that have personally owned scooters, which is great. But as we all know, that is putting more demand on the right-of-way. And how do we balance all these needs in a way that allows all these different technologies to operate safely and effectively? And I think, again, Lee, your conversation around the personal delivery devices and them navigating sidewalks, those realistic conversations around, if we allow those technologies to operate on sidewalks, what liabilities might cities be creating for themselves? A small child biking on a sidewalk, will they know how to avoid that robot? Will the robot know what to do if there is that accident? Who's going to be liable? And more importantly, how do we prevent those types of accidents in the first place? Whether it's signage, again, outreach and automation, outreach and engagement. I think all that comes into the play with this conversation. And I think, again, it starts with the infrastructure and how do we think about the redesign of infrastructure and how we prioritize right away to support all these different growing mobility solutions, and which are great because they're increasing options in our communities, which is the key to really having that heaven scenario around mobility. So, this slide is intended to show that, there are lots of potential uses for automation. In our work, I think we found three things are fundamentally important. It's really having clear definitions for how you define automation, for how you define the technology, and for how you align those definitions with the use cases. Again, focusing on those use cases and making sure you have a clear understanding of how you want the technology to solve an identified problem. And then how do you do the outreach and engagement and make sure that outreach and engagement is not just focused on presentations, but really trying to get the experiential component in there. So a lot of the projects we work on, there's rightfully skepticism around automation, but what we've seen is the moment that people experience it or see it in action, even when there are problems, people start to understand the opportunities more and are excited about it and want to try and see it work. And so it's that experience component is really important. And then, I mentioned earlier the status quo. So this is a depiction from one of the projects that we're working on with communities around looking at a corridor. And I think it's important to remember, we're not going to have complete change overnight. This is an effort that's going to take a number of years. It's going to take collaboration. It's going to take a multidisciplinary approach to get right. And what I would argue is, it's about starting with quote unquote the dumb stuff. And so if we can think about how we repurpose our streets to really leverage a safe way for these different technologies to operate, these different solutions, then we can slowly build the foundations that are needed for those multiple uses. And then, a lot of our work is focused on corridors right now. So how can we really identify the corridors that work best for these different types of technologies? So, this depiction is clearly focused on bike lanes and scooter lanes, really focused on enhancing that type of access. This may not be the right corridor to focus on automation because you want to ensure the safety of the pedestrians and the bicyclists. But if you do another corridor where, dare I suggest, you take away the vehicles from operating and make it more of a shared use corridor, then that could be something where you start to see automation come into play, supporting not just our traditional bus routes and traditional bus sizes, but more on-demand buses as well, leveraging some of the solutions we're seeing from companies like Via and May Mobility and their partnerships. You can have the personal delivery devices. And the way that we're doing this is we're really aligning it with what we're seeing are the use patterns around people's movement and the interest that lie within a corridor. So that could be if you have a corridor that's very heavy on commercial access, restaurants, you have a lot of people doing shopping, then those are the types of corridors where maybe you don't need as much. You can close off to vehicle movement and focus more on these pickup and drop-off zones and more of the automation components that can hopefully help support the safe operation of different types of vehicles. And I think it's important to think about, again, that structured versus unstructured setting. It's going to be easier to deploy these solutions in closed environments. So obviously we're doing a lot of work in airports. We're doing a lot of work on campuses for colleges, a lot of work, starting to see some of the work at ports. But of course, we have to be mindful of the labor component that comes into those conversations. But again, just a large way of saying that, kind of leverage the use case conversation with the infrastructure conversation and how do we really start to think about those foundational layers, particularly from an infrastructure perspective, to move forward and advance the status quo, maybe beyond our typical thinking of what a street can do, and instead trying to create more innovative and adaptable and flexible streets. We're really focused on integrated planning right now. So what I mean by that is, thinking about how can we really leverage infrastructure for multi-purpose and community-focused solutions. So this slide is our rendition of a community charging hub. And what it's trying to do is really leverage the conversation around EV charging with the conversation around land use and potential amenities, and even thinking about EVs as a potential shared use mobility type system. So, thinking about something where you have car share and you could come, park a car and then get a new one that's fully charged and do it through a shared model. And then be mindful of amenities that you may need for people with children, people with pets, and really trying to leverage this in a way that allows everybody to benefit. You could also see this as, benefiting hopefully a potential autonomous and electric fleet in the future, where you have Neuros operating, US Postal Service, FedEx, and Amazon. Again, it's having these chargers available for those fleets as well, and potentially you stagger it by time of day based on when that need is going to be most needed. And you then hopefully reduce vehicle miles traveled and allow, again, the multi-use of something like a community charging hub to also support the automation conversation as well. This is just a quick slide, with some of the policy, legal, and regulatory considerations that we've been thinking about. With this group, I really wanted to focus on the value and need for industry standards. I think, looking through the materials that the Urban Robotics Foundation has been putting forward, I think it's very important work, really having that standards discussion. I appreciate, Lee, your slide around what you're not trying to tackle. I think that's always the hardest part of, I think, everything we're doing right now and this innovation space, which is so exciting, is having a discipline to say no and staying focused. And I think that's a great part of the work that you all are doing. And the municipal guide, which I've had a chance to look through the draft, I think really does a nice job of focusing on aligning maturity of the technology with stages of implementation. And I think, again, that's what I want to also make sure that we're thinking about here is this technology is still evolving. And it's up to us to be thinking about how do we support that evolution and learn from these pilot projects to really think about what advances might be needed from an infrastructure perspective, what advances are needed from a public engagement perspective, and a policy and regulatory perspective as well. So where to start? Again, putting on my former lawyer hat, I think one place that we can really be thinking about is zoning. And this goes back to the slide around that community charging hub. I think zoning is a good example of a concept that needs to evolve if we want our communities to evolve. So, as cities have been evolving, originally zoning were these buffer areas to separate the industrial from residential. And with the decline in manufacturing that we're seeing, or manufacturing being put into more suburban and rural areas now, I think we have the opportunity to rezone at least urban areas or downtowns. And some concepts that we've been working on are innovation inclusion zones. Those zones really think about how can we incubate some of the technologies that we're talking about today, particularly personal delivery devices, or those sidewalk robots, as people like to call them, and then leverage that with ongoing land use and development and these mixed use developments that we're seeing. And then, of course, where we're seeing a lot of these mixed use developments are also areas where there's transit and transit oriented development. So how can we create a new zone that incubates those technologies, supports that convergence, and tries to reduce the need for personally owned vehicles through parking? And that is, where we are, it's complicated, it's hard, but I think there is this great opportunity to kind of have these focused new areas where you create these new zones, these new overlay zones, and then to move some solutions forward. Just want to put up some slides to show that, we're not, at least in our work, we're not just putting out concepts that aren't implementable. We're very focused on implementation. That makes it hard, but also exciting at the same time. So my job on our projects is to really think about how do we merge these innovative designs with planning and policy and regulatory considerations. So this is an example of a roadmap to implementation that we created for Centennial, Colorado. You'll see we set it up, short-term, medium-term, long-term plays. We're very mindful that cities have a lot on their plates these days, as do states. And there's a lot of different priorities out there. So, again, being in DC and having a chance to travel a lot to the West Coast, we're very mindful that cities have homelessness issues that they're dealing with right now, economic issues. In DC, we're seeing that from a downtown perspective. We have this looming fiscal cliff with transit. So, how do we make sure that we're incorporating a conversation around innovation in a smart way, in a mindful way, and making sure that we're identifying them as solutions that fit into cities' goals and objectives, and not just these shiny objects that could create distractions. And again, that's, I think, part of our challenge in making sure that we continue the conversation around automation in a smart way, but also, again, being mindful of what cities are looking for right now and what their concerns are. I think a really exciting area, at least that I'm interested in, is the opportunity for goods movement and thinking about delivery hubs in this concept. So that picture on the left are mailboxes, a picture that I took at a cul-de-sac community that we have some friends that live in Virginia. I actually had one of these mailboxes growing up in our near our house where I grew up in San Diego. And I thought it was this great idea for how you deliver mail. It was so efficient. It prevents the mailman from having to go to every single house. Yeah, you have to walk a little bit to go and check your mail, but it's just the efficiency it created. So then thinking about, okay, is this a potential opportunity for lockers to be placed in the right of way in communities, right? And this is thinking about a concept like neuro. So I know the folks at Neuro well. I've had conversations with them. This is, a purpose-built delivery robot just for the delivery of goods. It doesn't have any human driver, but with this day and age, a lot of people want that door-to-door service. So a challenge that they need to face is, how do you get those the things in the neuro device to the actual door, especially if nobody's home or if somebody has a disability. And so kind of a concept that we've been thinking about is lockers that allow a neuro device to potentially drive in with arms and to put the items into lockers for people to then go and collect their packages when it's convenient. And again, I think this is an example of something that would take an investment and coordination with a city to do an investment in lockers in the public right away. You need to dedicate public space to do something like this. And then the picture on the right is just from our Centennial project, to really think about, again, that multi-purposing of infrastructure. That's in addition to being a transit stop. It also could be a pickup and drop-off zone for an on-demand autonomous vehicle. And then there's also a concept around lockers, and this is outside of a store as well. And then there's also, of course, scooters, and this would be the concept of a mobility hub as well. But again, it's these new opportunities that innovation bring to allow us to repurpose space and then think about these solutions that hopefully provide more convenience. Just want to put up a quick slide around how do we move forward around the testing and deployment of these technologies. So this is a process we've developed from our work with a couple of different communities, looking to deploy and test technologies, but not just wanting to test them once, but to really come up with an approach that allows them to scale to other parts of a city, and then allows them to also reach a commercial implementation standpoint as well. And as you all know, if you've worked with any of the private companies in the space, that's like a key thing that all these companies need to have in a partnership, is how do you bring this to scale? Because if we don't see that commercial scaling, then the investment is going to start to dry out. So this is a way that we think we can move forward with this process. I think it's identifying the needs. The data analysis part of the pilot project, I think, is really important. Public outreach and engagement, stakeholder coordination, coordinate and streamline approval process. What that means is make sure, if you are going to be promoting this, if you are a city and want to see this type of technology, make sure you have a coordinated process where there's one person that or one department that a private company is going to be dealing with. And then this assessment piece is really important, and perhaps the most complicated and hardest part right now is, what are the metrics that we need to use to assess how a project's working, whether or not it's met its stated goals, and then how to learn from that assessment and move a project forward. And I think the key takeaway from this slide is this all takes resources. And so in order to get this right, and now's the time for our community to be investing, to really think about ways that public-private partnerships can help cities have the right resources to move this forward, and to make sure we're having the right conversations around analyzing the data from these projects. And then, we're talking about external infrastructure a lot. I think internal infrastructure is critically important. That's a big part of my work, is really thinking about organizational and governance structures needed to make a lot of this happen. The organizational structure conversation is really important and fascinating right now, and also very complicated. And I think kind of the key question it boils down to is, what types of departments do cities need in the future, and states, to support this next generation of mobility? What types of resources do they need? What types of personnel do you need to be thinking about? With all the conversations around artificial intelligence right now, I think really thinking about, what does your staff need to be trained in? Do they need to understand, how to evaluate AI from an ethical standpoint, from a equity standpoint as well. All these are very complicated questions, but I think they're important questions to have now, not just external infrastructure, but internal infrastructure, to make sure we can support the next generation of mobility and get it right to solve a lot of the mistakes that we made the last time that we had this transformational opportunity with the automobile. And I want to include some resources. I assume Lee will be sharing these slides afterwards. So these will all be accessible with a click. We did a multi-state coordination project with New England states that is really a deep dive into legal and regulatory issues for those wonks that are listening. You can really get a lot out of that. We did a project with the TRB Forum on automated vehicles and shared mobility. That this link is to a crosswork analysis dealing with 9 different topical areas. And then the Future Mobility Report, it was a week-long charrette we did in Buffalo, New York, really focused on mobility and innovation. And then discusses a lot of things I talked about, particularly around zoning and really merging land use, mobility and innovation into the conversation around revitalizing downtowns. And then here's my contact information. Certainly welcome the chance to engage after this and look forward to the Q&A. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
Oh, can you leave your screen up for a minute, oh, Greg, sure, just so people have a chance to record your email if they want to do that? I'll suggest that you can turn it off and we'll just go to gallery view in a few minutes. So I just want to let people know that now's the time for our Q&A. I see lots of activity in the chat that I'm happy to call up. And if you wanted to come on screen and ask your questions yourself, please do that. So I'm going to hopefully my dog won't bark again, but I'm going to start with Janet Lowe. You had a couple of comments in here. I don't know if you wanted to come on screen. I'm happy to do that, but you were talking, I think this was around the time that you mentioned the fiscal cliff, Greg, the comment. Janet, who is from the city of Toronto, was saying the financial cliff, she says that we need funding for simply upgrading the power grid and the existing state of good repair and maintenance. So Toronto Hydro has over a $10 billion deficit. I guess that's not addressed. That's not a question per se, but just an interesting comment for sure. And then Bavisha had a question about, and she's referring here to needing a holistic view to promote sustainable and efficient change. Given your familiarity with policy and regulation, what can the average person do to support a holistic approach? And she goes on to say, most leaders and decision makers appear to prioritize short-term economic considerations rather than taking the long-term view in terms of sustainability and accessibility.
Yeah, I think that's a great point and question. It's very complicated. So I'll take one project as an example because it's fresh in my mind right now. So we're working in the city of Buffalo on a smart streets design project. And what we've learned there is that, that's where we did that future mobility report. What they first needed to do was just to get all of these conversations out in the open. And then we were lucky enough to help them develop this report that we drafted like a strategy for them. So it brought all the conversations under one roof and gave them a strategy for action. So I think kind of the first thing that can be done is get stakeholders to invest in a strategy, just to, again, get all the conversations under one roof. And then the other thing we learned within Buffalo, there are a number, as we all know, different stakeholders in different communities. So you have economic development groups, you have business interests, you have bike and ped groups. The important part too is to really align those conversations together around that strategy and to make sure you have the input on a direct path and make sure everybody's engaged. So I think the key part of it is coming up with a plan and then getting everybody to buy into the plan, and then helping get everybody coordinated around how to move the plan forward, and getting input on what recommendations would I like to see implemented first. But helping communities become proactive is one of the harder things to do, and I think that's where the experiential part of the conversation and even getting people engaged on the opportunities around technology hopefully helps.
I'm just going to add to that because I did have a chance to review the Buffalo report that you included in your slide deck because I had a preview. Um, and I was really impressed by how many stakeholder groups they were engaged in that charrette. And so, Bhavisha, I'm not sure, how involved you are in your community, but the idea really, from my perspective, was that with I guess it was probably from the mayor, or, maybe Stantec was the one who brought that group together, but just the idea of how many people came together in that 1 week charrette just before COVID started. I just thought it was fascinating to get all those perspectives and just keep that dialogue going, right? So it's not about starting, it's like progress over perfection, and just like, how do you make those first steps? I was really impressed by that report.
Yeah, and I think just that's a really good point, Lee. You do need a champion within the city. So the city had a champion that brought it all together. This was, their idea, and we were happy to help support it. But identifying that champion can also be a big part of the battle.
Okay, very great. Stephanie Dock from Washington, DDOT, has a question. I love the notion of flexible streets, but how do we communicate the uses? Signage and striping make it hard to communicate anything complex or changing.
Stephanie, always with a good implementation. So that's a good, that's the key question. And even when you think about using something like Park Mobile, I am constantly frustrated that I can't always see the sticker, or sometimes it's gone, right? So I think this gets, and again, the Buffalo project as an example, the conversation around maintenance. And so it's not just about building it. It's really making sure you have a plan around maintenance, and how do you make sure that some of these unplanned or unforeseen issues can be addressed moving forward. And even, our notion of a flexible street, like we are even including concepts like movable bollards for like pickup and drop off zones, really thinking about opportunities around curbless streets. But there is this question around, does the city have the budget or ability to move those bollards every day? Like, who's going to do that? So I think your question really teases out the conversation around not just designing something that can be built, but designing something that can be maintained, continued, and also something that can evolve as the technologies evolve as well. So I won't say I have the perfect answer, but I think your question brings out something that needs to be planned for and a part of any sort of project as you're designing these new flexible and adaptable streets. I don't know if you want to add anything, Stephanie, based on your experience.
I was just going to say the Christmas tree of signs is also the bane of our existence, where like if you're trying to do stuff with the curb, you've seen it, Greg, in DC, and I know other cities have it, where it's just like somehow we've stacked 7 signs on that pole. And when we try and consolidate and communicate more, we actually make it harder. And I know there's been some work on the parking side, but that also I think gets back to the part where if you don't communicate it until someone comes in, if you're trying to do something particularly on the curb and you're not communicating it until they've actually gotten to the point where they can read the sign, you're often too late. Like the variable use needs to be perceivable before you've pulled into the curb and attempted to park, and some sense of that. And so we ran into it with demand-based parking pricing, of trying to, how do we get the word out in advance that, this block is cheap and this one's expensive and they look the same, but how do you know that before you go, so that you can actually respond to the pricing signals? And I think there's some interesting linkages with the future of kind of this discussion around digital infrastructure.
Awesome, thank you.
If you go to that event, please tell me what you hear.
No, and I think you hit the nail on the head, Stephanie, again, with the digital infrastructure comment, which I was thinking of. I mean, again, like a lot of these evolutions are happening post-COVID, because I think we learned a lot about what our expectations are as consumers and kind of how we can potentially leverage innovation. So I know you've talked about some of the great things you all have done with signage, with QR codes, to inform the public. I think that is something we may see in the future. Of course, that requires maintenance. But there's also the, equity conversation that comes there. If you don't have a smartphone, or if you have a disability, we need to make sure that we're still incorporating that into the things. But again, this is like the basic infrastructure conversation I think it's important to be having. And just when we think about crosswalks and with, verbal cues at crosswalks, these important innovations that don't get talked about the way they should, but that is smart technology. Hopefully, again, that balances into the holistic conversation and using those as foundations to build from as we move forward. This is a great question, Stephanie. Thanks.
Fabulous. I'm going to jump around a little bit because we're getting near the end. Jack Dean has a question. Can you say a bit more on your point that AV shuttles start in specific corridors or non-public roadways?
Sure, I'm just catching up the question. Maybe start in specific corridors or non-public roadways. Sure. So there, I mean, so we work in a number of cities and a number of states. One of the challenges, at least here in the United States, we don't have as coordinated of a process around autonomous vehicles that we've seen in Canada. And so what we try to stress when we're working with cities and some of our private companies is, you know, the regulatory roadmap is a little complicated right now. So if there isn't a clear path to testing, you need to find these ways to maybe get it off of public roadways and to potentially think about, okay, like on a college campus, there may be less regulatory approvals that are needed. So you could start it there. And then as that project gains momentum on a college campus, the city or might be interested in having it expand, let's say, to a local grocery store. And then there, at least you have a demonstrated pilot project that is working, has momentum, and then you have the city that could hopefully be the lead in getting any regulatory approvals within the state or being that conduit to try and advance the conversation. And then kind of the other point around corridors is really, so we do a lot of work with location-based data these days. So streetlight data, INRIX data. Of course, it's all anonymous. We're always very mindful of privacy, but this data does give you really important information around user behavior and how people are using a corridor. So if you see a lot of people taking transit on a corridor, doing multiple stops or just one stop shopping, then again, those corridors might be places where it makes sense to deploy an autonomous vehicle and potentially reduce on-street traffic so that you can create those operating environments that allow the autonomous shuttle to work and decrease the need for a car. So that's kind of what I meant there. Hopefully that helps answer your question.
I'm not sure if Jack didn't come on screen, so I'm not sure if he wants to do any follow-up, but I'm going to jump to a couple of comments from Jennifer Neese. So regarding, I'll just start with the last one, which is regarding AVs on private roads. Jack says that's helpful. Thanks. Good. Okay. So Jennifer says there may be less regulatory approvals on those private roads, but also less complex transportation movements and more consistency for the vehicle. And then her previous question was, given the very much evolving state of the technology and the lengthy cycle of infrastructure upgrades, what do you recommend for cities to address infrastructure in a way that avoids wasted money or maybe minimizes? I'm not sure you can ever avoid it, but stranded assets and other things like that.
I think, again, this goes back to focusing on a strategic plan. And so again, with going back to the Buffalo project, what we're really doing is there are a number of departments within the city of Buffalo that are involved with this project that don't just touch the street. We have Parks and Rec involved. Obviously, we have parking involved. We have public works involved, planning involved. And it's trying to get everybody on the same page around what are the concepts that they think will work or will not work with this smart street. And then it's also thinking about these future readiness issues that come up, maintenance and resources that may be needed. And then, having this candid conversation on what's actually feasible as the city plans to redo these streets, like how much investment should be done, which I think is the core of the question. So what conduit should be laid and where, if this is a street where they want to potentially have EV charging in the future on the street, or if we start to think about things like inductive charging and parking spots or pickup and drop off zones, how can you start to invest in this infrastructure now to have it ready? You may not go all in and put the chargers in now, but to at least know where the conduit is for potentially chargers in the future, or small cells to support 5G from a connectivity and wireless perspective. It's bringing in different departments to have a conversation around future readiness and to make sure that you develop a checklist that is done for every street moving forward, so that anytime the city is going to go and even repave a street, are there opportunities to do these future readiness components that support either a smart street or some of these concepts that we're starting to discuss around digital infrastructure. So again, it's not, you don't have to do the cannonball into the pool. You can just dip your toe, but it's coordinating around how people are going to invest in the resources and that everybody has the same checklist.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try to condense the last question here, and if anybody has to drop off, please go ahead. But so this is actually a combination of Janet and Stephanie talking about signage and asset conditions. So the real problems to address it, to enable micromobility, are the need for robots that could help with asset condition assessment of cycle tracks, for example, and automated enforcement to find and prevent illegal car and truck parking in the cycle track, and robots to help address how to maintain the cycle track, so assess potholes, debris, diagnose, clean, repair, etc. And Stephanie replied saying DC is testing whether the PDDs can help us maintain our sign inventory. And then there's a follow-up. Stephanie also provided a link to, when she was talking, the reference to the signage with the QR codes. It was for communicating about smart city tech deployed through the Digital Trust for Places and Routines, so dtpr.io. So I don't know if there's a question there, but Greg, if you just want to make some closing comments, that would be great. And then I'll pull up our closing slide.
Yeah, sure. Just a quick, I think this gets to the point around use cases for the automation. So it's not just about passenger movement. It's not just about goods delivery. It's also this opportunity to maintain assets, as the thread is talking about. And, you know, when you think about places with a lot of snow, the opportunity to deploy automated vehicles in cycle tracks to plow the snow is a great opportunity and use case that we're starting to see come forward. So yeah, completely agree. And just, you know, again, to be able to send out autonomous vehicles at 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning to go assess infrastructure, to find some of these issues that, you know, are being talked about in the chat, I think that's absolutely right. So it's kind of the off-peak hour potential use of automation, I think, is good. And I mean, and I know there's always the workforce conversation, but there's also the human element of the conversation. And I mean, I don't think anybody should be working at 2 or 3 in the morning if they don't have to be. So how do we alleviate some of those pressures and hopefully get people better trained to higher paying jobs is, I think, you know, the challenge that we need to confront as well at the same time.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your presentation today, Greg. And I'm just going to pull up our closing slide here. We didn't really get a chance to go through too much of I had some other content, but we'll tackle that another time. And it's really just to invite those of you who are still on the call to please follow us on LinkedIn for the latest updates. I will be issuing a recording of this webinar, and it will go on our brand new YouTube channel. If you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, that would be great as well. And we also welcome new memberships at any time. So please take a look at our website. I'll just quickly show you that our memberships, oops, there we go. Our membership group includes a number of different types of companies, many of whom were on the call today. And we thank you for your time. And again, Greg, thank you for a very interesting presentation. And I will make the slide deck available in a blog post for anybody who's interested. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Lee. Appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone.